So welcome everyone, and we'll just give you a few minutes to join us. And for those who are joining us on Facebook, this is our conversations from the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project and Center for Islamophobia at UC Berkeley. And we've been having these conversations since March. As COVID-19 set in, we had to find ways to really connect, but also to bring in individuals that have an impact in the community and their work have both a lasting impression, but also provide us with nuggets that we could continue, both the edible ones and the regular ones. So today our guest is Reem Assil. And I was mentioning that Assil is a person of origin, foundation, source. We say Ibn Assil, meaning that you are a person of family origin. So Reem is both a Palestinian-Syrian, and she's I don't no longer say up and coming, but she's a major chef in the Bay Area, connected to the ebbs and flows of what takes place in the Bay Area, both on the activist side, but also there is no revolution without the stomach. As they say, the change in society have to account both for people marching out, but also people needing to be fed on a regular basis. So I want to really have a conversation with you, and thank you for accepting and welcome. So just give us a little bit biography about you, your origin, your background, education, and then we could delve into some of the questions that we have.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It feels like full circle to connect with you, Hatem, from the very beginning days where you actually are sort of on that journey of my evolution as an activist and, you know, as an Arab Muslim living in this country. Like Hatem said, I am the child of Palestinian and Syrian immigrants. My parents immigrated here right towards the end of the Lebanese civil war. You know, things were getting really bad at that time. Israel had bombarded Lebanon, and they immigrated here to the US, where I was born. I grew up in a very small suburb outside of Boston. For, you know, my whole childhood, it was really sort of being one of the few Arabs, let alone Muslims, in my town that I was hyper aware. I mean, if you're Palestinian, basically by default, you're politicized from a very early age. But sort of in the journey of sort of understanding my identity as American living here in the US, I really took to other communities and struggle.
Where about in the Boston area?
Yeah, Sudbury, Massachusetts. Very small town. Yeah, very white.
Because yesterday I was actually lecturing on the American-Syrian League, of early arrivals into the area of Boston.
Absolutely, yeah.
One of the earliest membership cards that we read from the Arab Museum was from 1892.
Wow. I know that the Syrian, well, Syrian and Lebanese, or like what is now Lebanon, a lot of them settled in that area. So many generations. Yeah. Unfortunately, that was a generation removed from my parents as sort of new immigrants. I have these stories of my father moving and like just opening up the white pages. At the time we had actual books with people's numbers in it, and looking up everybody whose name was Muhammad and calling them up. But that's how we built community. So from a very early age, I sort of learned that. But I, you know, I think my upbringing, living in a very suburban area where you were the few, one of the few, really sort of made me hyper aware of my identity and sort of trying to understand what it meant to be Arab in America or to be Muslim in America. And I gravitated towards those struggles, the civil rights struggles, the struggle of indigenous people. And I became sort of committed to social justice work from a very early age. I ended up going to Tufts University, and my dream was to be a not a gastro diplomat. I would call myself now a gastro diplomat. But I wanted to be a diplomat. I had this sort of idea that I could use my privilege sort of from a US standpoint to create policies that were more favorable to the Arab world. And I was very sobered to the realities of what academia here teach, that sort of those neoliberal concept that like the peace means like the US maintaining its control all over the world. So that was very sobering. And of course, my first week on the Tufts campus was 9/11. So that forever changed sort of my relation to the world and the relation to the US. And I unfortunately got very sick at the time and developed some severe sort of gastrointestinal severe acid reflux, as they would say. And I had to leave school. And I just so happened to have an uncle living out here who was an activist, Iyad, who I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
And I just picked San Francisco on the map and moved out here to take a break from academia and really understand like what is this world and how do we make change. And I feel like my time in San Francisco, sort of moving here in 2003, right as the US was invading Iraq, good time for me, actually, sort of as I was slowly dying inside in academia, trying to figure out how do you affect change, sort of to be part of an anti-war movement and to learn sort of how change happens from the ground up was really sort of a pivotal moment for me. So yeah, that's when I moved out here in 2003, and I went back for a very short time to finish my my studies, and then moved back out here permanently in 2005.
And San Francisco is a unique place because it has a community. The Arab, Muslim, Palestinian community has a long, in some of my studies in Berkeley, I know that some Arabs arrived to study in Berkeley in the late 20s, early 30s.
Right.
So it's definitely have a different feel to it than
it was so like you feel like you're part of a community, because even like trying to connect to Arabs on the campus of Tufts, it was like we had the Arab Student Union and people were afraid of that being politicized, like something so called. So we didn't have, like the first day I landed on campus, it was like Friends of Israel. It was very hard. I mean, even towards the last week that I was at Tufts, my friend was beaten up almost to death by fraternity, and the campus didn't want to call it a hate crime. So that was the kind of environment. So to be in San Francisco and to really be around people who've been embedded in sort of ground up organizing and to see changes and to see community that's really sort of struggling more, not just the Palestinian struggle, but how that's connected to the anti-war struggle and how that's connected to the struggle of Black and brown folks in this country. That was like, that just changed my whole outlook. And so, yeah, I pursued more quote unquote, like that's the other thing that I discovered, is that you could get paid to organize. So I was a labor organizer. I organized workers on the ground. I organized airport workers. I was a community organizer. I worked in organizations that built coalitions between faith, community, and workers to like really win these pivotal fights in the development of Oakland. So that work was really amazing. But
let me ask a question. In one of my classes, we're reading Mustafa Bayyoumi's book, How Does It Feel to Be a Problem? And he's looking at the Arab Muslim subject in constantly being problematized. So maybe we could ask the question, how does it feel to be Arab Palestinian and being a chef, which is an area also that's a different terrain and different topography?
Yeah, I mean, I think I used to, people
because the activist part, is like we're wired.
Totally. Yeah, I think like entering the sort of food world, I entered into a much more mainstream world. I was very sort of intentional about entering that world. I knew that I had sort of dual purpose. Like I wanted to pursue food as a passion, but also as a political act. So being able to balance those two. But one of the things that I decided really intentionally was that I was going to call it Arab. Nobody, I mean, immigrants here in the US up until really now. I feel like I was one of the pioneers in popularizing the word Arab food. We're calling it Mediterranean or Greek or Middle Eastern at best, but what is the Middle East? That's a colonial construct. So for me to say I'm Arab, and this is not a bad word, because when you tell people you're Arab, they're like afraid to say the word as if it's a bad word. Yeah. So I wanted to like normalize it and mainstream it and make it acceptable to say that, and to say, to claim foods that have been invisibilized, like Palestine, words like Palestine and Palestinian. So that has been a hard terrain, but it hasn't come without successes. Like, I think that people have moved, and the more and more you're seeing in these like mainstream magazines that the word Arab is being used, but it certainly was sort of a complicated terrain, because immediately when you say your food is Palestinian, you're inviting someone to engage with you, and sometimes ways that you're not really in the mood to engage. Sure. Like our identity is like an affront to just by its very existence is affront to some people, and that I think that has been a challenge that I've gladly accepted, but it hasn't come without struggle.
I know that your interest in food, and I read that you were in Lebanon.
Yes.
There's a bakery around the corner, which again, the notion of imaginary and what the smells, the senses, and then how that becomes also part of captivating your horizon, to pursue that as your passion.
Yeah.
So talk about that, your Lebanon.
My trip to Lebanon, and Syria, really. I mean, those two places, I think as somebody in diaspora, you're always afraid to visit those places, especially as an adult. I have some memories of it as a child, but there's trauma, I think, embedded in there. There's generational trauma. And so to be able to go there and to really sort of see my father enjoy the homeland, it's his memories, but for me to like feel fully immersed through this historical memory, and it really was in those food spaces. And the epiphany that I had in that moment was really, it was twofold. One, that Arabs are the masters of bread and hospitality. That in fact, Arab hospitality is the thing that has helped us survive despite the political turmoil around us, right? Like the food spaces have always been, you say the revolutions are born in the stomach, they're born in the cafes and the bakeries, these communities that people have been able to build that really connect the rich and the poor in the bread. That is the thing that is like the central, even in the most remote villages, there's like a post office and a bakery.
There's a narrative in some of the religious sources that that Adam himself was a baker. So if we think about one of the oldest,
like it's alchemy.
Alchemy is making that, basic staple of food, and then think of Egypt, where bread is aish, which is life.
Yeah, bread is life. Even from the Bible, all of the religious scriptures say these things. And I'm like, okay, so this is a chance to share with the American public, like we're not, like all the images that I had been bombarded with of myself growing up here is like, we're either the terrorist or the refugee. There's nothing in between. And here I'm like seeing this life, and I'm seeing, so I wanted to bring that back. I was very feeling like selfishly, for my own healing, to be reconnected to my roots and to understand the history of my people through food. But the second and even more important piece of this was that actually the American context, the organizing that I'm doing here locally with both Arab community and diaspora, but also other communities of color, we are missing these third spaces. We are missing these sanctuary places where there is an aspect of like the communal part of it, right? The place that it's like part of your daily routine. The bakery is where people connect, are sustained, can meet, all of these things that have a certain political, and I know that the San Francisco has history of these third spaces. So I wanted to recreate that because I felt like in my organizing, we were just fighting,
Mm-hmm.
but we weren't building the world that we were actually wanting to see. So I wanted to I was like, oh, well, we have something to teach there, like as Arabs, like who are good at this. Let me bring sort of my social justice background and this knowledge of my people and combine it into this enterprise. So yeah, that was sort of the epiphany I had. And I came back and I enrolled myself in a baking pastry program. And I literally learned how to be a baker with the idea that I was going to start a bakery one day.
Now, you won the, let me see, it's the National Open Table Contest in 2016. And then from that, you came to open your place in Fruitville District. Mm-hmm. So how the journey of that, and then we could speak about the whole campaign.
Oh, yeah. That campaign.
That
yes.
campaign. And again, that to have anything relative to Palestine Arab is always contested. Right. It's just that there's always that contestation.
Yes.
And I say that we don't have the pleasure of thinking stupid thoughts to our own self, because we always have to, what you call, be editing and worry that somebody is actually either monitoring or saying that what you're doing is unacceptable. Yeah, so speak of that journey, and then we get into a little bit more.
Yeah. I mean, I can say, I think that, so what was that, 2016, when I won that contest? Really the journey to get there, I mean, I would have to say that my success has really been the success of my community helping me. I don't think that I would have been able to win that contest or even find the resources to open my spot had it not been for community groups like La Cuisine. They were an incubator program that helped me build my business from the ground up. But then also the movement that I had built of all of this community, I feel like while I was not rich with material resources, I was very rich with social capital.
Sure.
Because I had built with people over years doing the organizing work, and they were the ones who really sort of helped me get this thing off the ground and keep it sustainable, So yeah, we opened our doors in 2017 after doing some, and Fruitville is really kind of an interesting place, because when I imagine my bakery, I wanted it to be a space that was inviting for all walks of life. Like the idea that that Arab bread and hospitality has no walls. We have no barriers. That we are if you come and we have zero tolerance for racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, all these things. But if you're here with an open mind, we're going to take you in, and you're going to feel a sense of home in a time where home is an elusive thing. And I feel like in Oakland and specifically, there are many places that don't feel like home anymore. People are being displaced left and right. So the Fruitville felt very special to us because it was in this transit area. It was, still a primarily Latinx community, but also an Arab community. And there are people from, there's still sort of the original people from Oakland still dwelling there. So it was very diverse. And that's who I wanted to see in my bakery. So it was like a dream come true. But it also was the first week that we opened, or a couple of weeks after, I found out I was pregnant. Which was, sort of, thank you, sort of planned. My husband and I were okay, we're going to open this. We're going to wait a little bit, but the blessings, they say in our culture, the blessings come on blessings. But 2 weeks after, we started to get bombarded with hate, death threats through email and phone calls and Yelp message, anywhere you could possibly think of. We started to have people start threatening us and saying we hope your bakery blows up and all these things. It was the week, I remember very vividly when this happened. It was Charlottesville had happened. And a lot of sort of heightened right-wing sort of forces had been really emboldened at this moment. And it was all over a mural that I had in my bakery that depicted really what it was a depiction of was the intersection of struggle of communities. So it had, so when we were building Reem's Out, one of the things that was happening that felt like a huge blow to the Palestinian community was, you know, our dear like mentor and really like hero activist in the Palestinian community, Rasmia Odeh, was being, from Chicago, was faced with one of the most egregious sort of assaults from the government on, you know, our civil liberties as Palestinians, but also our human rights. I mean, this was like a 70-something-year-old woman who had done nothing but civic engagement in her community in Chicago. She was like she had so much family.
Connected to the interfaith.
Everything.
Jewish Voice for Peace, all the networks that are there.
Latino communities, Black communities. She was on the forefront of all of it. And to have that stripped away from us, for the government to say you're a threat and to deport her, like we were devastated. Like I think that especially like young activists like me, we were devastated. And so I really I know that her story, unfortunately, it was a high profile story, but it's not the only story like that. I have dear friends who I grew up with who are in jail, you know, locked up or deported because of these things. So
maybe you said that your arrival to college was at 9/11. But from 9/11, I would say that the majority of legal cases that were brought against individuals in the United States post 9/11, I would say 90 to 95% of those cases had to do with Palestine. So again, the targeting of Palestinians, and therefore, again, a Palestinian space, body, business, location, if they come out as Palestinian, it is subject against to this systematic targeting.
And I was like, there was a part of me that was really naive. Like, I didn't think that this was going to get so much backlash. Like, I thought, I'm in Oakland, we can make political statements, you know? And like, for me, of course, like putting up Rasmia and paying homage to her was a political act. I mean, if you look at the mural, she's wearing a pin of Oscar Grant, you know, a young Black man who was killed
right down the street.
Like literally on the platform right above our bakery, you know, like we didn't want to forget his story. So what we're saying here is that our struggles are intersectional, and we need to, you know, like that is what, you know, our opposition is scared of, is like if we start to see our struggles as intersectional and how they're connected, the same police that are, you know, that are killing Oscar Grant are trained by the forces that that tortured, that sexually tortured and physically tortured this woman, and you know, locked her up when she, you know, like, so these are the same forces.
And then Oakland, you have Urban Shield, which also the joint training programs are taking place.
Exactly. The connections are very real, and so we wanted to be intentional about that. Like, we have Tatriz in the back, but it also looks like indigenous, you know, and you know, to really demark the farm worker struggle here in California. So we really wanted to be intentional. But above all, honestly, I wanted the figure of a brown woman, you know, an elder, to tell me it's okay not to, don't be afraid. Like, all of the depictions of Rasmia have been really militant. And I wanted to depict a happy Rasmia, a Rasmia that was the life of the party, because like as Arabs, we are multifaceted. We've gone through so many struggles, and yet we live and we enjoy life, and we enjoy this bread, and we dance, and we, you know, we do all the things. So that, you know, so to me, I was like, this is a celebration of culture, of our resilience more than anything else. And unfortunately, that is a threat to people. Like, our existence and our resilience is a threat to folks.
Maybe you could talk about the attacks came, but the solidarity that came out of it. I thought,
like I woke up.
The solidarity, the which again, always the struggle has both what you call the yin and yang. There's struggle that has taken place. So how was the solidarity, and how do people receive what transpired?
Yeah, I mean, for me, obviously there's the contradiction of capitalism. Like I had a business to run. I was like afraid I was going to lose my business. So, you know, I was pregnant. There was all these things. So having community support was not only integral to sort of fighting Zionist forces, but to keeping me safe and being able to take care of my business. I think that above all was sort of the first response. It was like, I called in, you know, folks from Jewish Voices for Peace and IJAN, International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, and Critical Resistance and AROC, you know, all these people that I had built with, and we devised sort of a emergency strategy, you know, because not only was I dealing with death threats and a bombardment of my Yelp, and I mean, like I one day woke up and there were 800 one-star reviews from all over the world. And to me, I was like, well, maybe I've done something right. I mean,
you didn't have 800 customers.
No, I mean, these were like fake reviews and it was crazy. I mean, I was just like, why do people care? Like, am I that much of a threat? So to me, I was like, maybe I did something right. But they also started showing up like these sort of very fringe pro-Israeli groups that were aggressive and vicious and put my workers in harm and like actually attacked some of my customers. It was a real threat. So we would like activate anytime they'd show up, folks in the community who had a devised plan to really de-escalate and to like shut that down. And so our strategy was really to use this, you know, it's called political jiu-jitsu, as you call it, is like to turn the might of your colonizer upon itself. And I think that's really what happened there was like, I had a choice, right? Because I had PR people being like, why don't you just, like even my parents were like, no, just take the mural, like paint something on top of it. Or something. I'm like, no, I'm not gonna do that. It's not like, you know, or you can double down, you know, and really lean into this and use it as a
as a springboard.
As a springboard to educate the public of who Rasmiya is, what this backlash is, how Palestinians go through this all the time. But this is not the first example. We have examples even here in the Bay Area of repression from organized Zionist forces. So I got all of those, and some of my partners who were more mainstream were like, we don't know how to deal with this, because they started to attack people I was partnered with. You know, they were really trying to isolate me. And it was scary and it was isolating at the time. But the more that I developed sort of a relationship and a trust with these partners to be like, this is not about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. This is Islamophobic. This is an anti-Arab thing. You know, like really kind of pivoting off of like, this is what this is really embedded in is white supremacy. You know, this is how Zionism works. Then I started to educate them, and a lot of them came around. You know, I wouldn't say everybody is not scared of Zionist forces because they're still very powerful. But I think that I feel like I triumphed because I didn't let them get to me so emotionally, where I wasn't able to stay on my own message, you know, because I never sort of apologized for anything because I had nothing to be sorry for. You know, here I am trying to help my community. I'm this, you know, woman of color in this industry that is not, you know, like, not kind to, it's a very hard industry. And here are these like right-wing forces who are rich, you know, like to the public that looked ridiculous. You know, there were obviously people came to my side and all of it. So, you know, right now in our bakery, we have a plaque that's like, this is who Rasmiya was. This is what her struggle represents. This is what this wall represents. And it's actually, I thank the Zionists for, or I think that attack, because it gave me a chance to really talk about the struggle.
Well, so I also want maybe to talk about, you had Draymond Green
Yes.
on the menu. And that also was an important
He
political
broke my heart.
intervention on your part. I know they won the championship, but take us through that, because again, you're
Yeah.
making a conscious decisions
Yeah.
that really are changing and altering the political landscape through food.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, one thing is like, whether intentionally or not, I feel like, well, maybe not so anymore. I'm like a little bit more explicit now that I have a platform. But
Yes,
I imagined Reams and a lot of food spaces, I'm not the only one out there doing this,
sure.
is it's the work of consciousness raising, right? Because if we only sort of preach to the choir, we're very insular. We're not going to build movement, right?
Mm.
And so sort of walking into Reams spaces is sort of like what we call a Trojan horse effect. You know, the story of the Trojan horse,
Mm-hmm.
like you don't know what's hitting you. And then like all of a sudden, and it's not like we're beating politics over your head. It's like a slow progression of your shift in worldview just by engaging with our workers, engaging with the food, engaging with the atmosphere. And I feel like that is the way that I had been doing my work and have been for the most part. I mean, not everybody is woke who
Mm-hmm.
comes to Reams or understands politics, but something shifts, right? Like even when they ask, where does the manouche come from? And, you
Mm-hmm.
know, that opens a conversation. And so at the same time, I'm very Oakland, right? Like I'm
Yes.
as much Arab and Palestinian as I am Oakland. I have like homage to this community that's taken me in for the last 15 years that I've lived here. And so we're Warriors fans. And so like we speak this language of like so many different people
But
that
they
like
went to
we
San
have.
Francisco now.
I
That's
know, it's
broken
so
up.
sad. They broke my heart
I
twice,
know
you know? I
it's
know. It's just, but now we're in San Francisco, so
yes.
go figure. You know, so I feel like I have like an audience, a captive audience, so to speak. And so using my platform for good, you know, like I don't think Draymond Green even cares
Mm-hmm.
that he's not a sandwich, but he was a sandwich for
Yeah.
many, like, and that was an icon, right? People loved that. It was a fan favorite, but the conversations it spurred for me making that stand and taking that open letter, I was so surprised by how much support I
Mm-hmm.
had. That would have never happened 5-6 years ago. So something is shifting
Yeah.
even within the food world and the larger cultural sort of periphery that I play, you know, because I think food intersects with cultural work, right?
Well,
And
it's the
yeah,
essence of culture, It's just
yeah, exactly. And
culture with.
so,
If you think about all the things that communities do, all the festivals that goes around food,
yeah,
all the celebration that are incomplete
yeah,
without food, and then all the recipes that are passed on generation,
yep,
which again
yeah.
is to back to the questions in terms, what does it mean to be a chef that is Arab and Palestinian, and what does it mean as you see some of the items in our cuisine is already being what you call claimed
Yes,
uh, in all
yeah,
different spaces.
yeah. Well, I look to people, you know, who came before me, like, you know, there's like Leila Haddad, for
Mm-hmm.
instance, who is like an amazing historian, and she wrote The Gaza Kitchen. And that was really eye-opening of like, how do you talk about, like, you can't talk about food ever in a vacuum, you
Mm-hmm.
know? And for me, you know, the sort of conversation about ownership of food in and of itself, I don't really care for. Sort of people jockeying for ownership, I think doesn't
Yeah, well,
like
food is
it.
always what you call malleable and it moves.
Yeah, it's
But when it,
deductive
yeah, but when it
talking. It's
becomes a
about the
part of,
context.
it becomes the
Yes,
context and the political
yes,
discussions around it and the
yes.
erasure of the other. So if somebody said,
Right.
this is a
Yes.
Palestinian recipe of
Yeah.
hummus,
And we're now calling it Israeli.
right,
Yes,
then that's no
exactly.
longer really is
Right.
shaping
Right.
the
Exactly.
context
And
of
so
the
that
food,
was
but
like,
rather it's continued iteration.
that was, you know, I think that was one of my many motivators to sort of stake my claim in a realm that was like, you had two sort of things happening. You had one, the de-ethnicization of our food into this like abyss of American identity,
Mm.
whatever that means, right? Like we're in the melting pot. It's like, no, there's nothing melting here. Like you're just melting us away. But then you have this like very intentional, well-funded machine that is producing this branded Israeli food that is very intentionally about normalizing the state of Israel and Israeli culture, and really sort of combating these larger political wins that we've had around boycott, divestment, and sanctions, about denormalizing apartheid and denormalizing, you know, occupation and all these things. So like, it's definitely a response, because like, even if you talk to some, even chefs who like were in Israel and came here to the US, there's like the Israeli food craze is a very American thing. So like the Israeli government is putting tons and tons of money into really sort of, it's like they can't leave us alone over there. I mean, they're bothering us. Like, that's what my elders joke about. It's like, they can't just leave us alone over here. Like, we can't even be Palestinian and the diaspora. They have to erase us, especially in the US, where they're getting, it is in sort of, their normalization is like a prerequisite to getting funding, right? And getting complicity or complicitness from the American public, right? Where our tax dollars go to fund that state. Funny story is that like, even in, there's like a gastro diplomacy program in Israel that is really sort of intentionally also bringing American chefs to go there and talk about and do this like farm to table and all this stuff, when like, ironically, they're like raising lands and like agriculture. I'm like, whose farm? Like what, like off of theft, you know? And so I've used my platform to really sort of engage American chefs. Do not take these free trips. Do not be like Draymond Green. You know, these are my peers who are being co-opted, and they're not just co-opting sort of high profile Jewish chefs. Now they're co-opting chefs of color, you know, chefs with a social justice platform. Like, social justice has become like the in thing in the food world, which really bothers me. Like, I sort of want to stay on the fringes a little bit because that gets co-opted. But it's really imperative for me as a Palestinian chef to denormalize that. Like, you cannot engage with that and be a person of conscience. Like, you can't stand for social justice on everything but the question of Palestine. And so those are the kind of conversations that are harder to have, but we're having them.
Yeah. I think people don't realize the hegemonic nature and the stitching together of this mosaic. So you have normalization at the university, you have normalization at the school level, you have normalization of the labor union and taking labor activists, you have the normalization of the Christian Zionists, you have normalization of the Muslim space with Muslim Leadership Initiative and other projects. And therefore,
cultural, like the sports figures,
the food. So this is where, again, being Palestinian, you are constantly faced with this dynamic that there is no space that you are not contested. You're living the Nakba thousands of miles away from Palestine. And that's what I say, the Nakba continues because you are not being able to be normal.
Yeah. And like, you know, I try to really balance and pick my fights. Like what, you know, like I understand that there could be a role that I, like strategic roles that I play within the food world to move people slowly. And then there's like times where I have to really be sort of on the extreme pole. The sort of lane that I choose to occupy is really to build coalition with people who really sort of are worthy of fight. I know will fight in this fight with me and not will get scared when they receive backlash, because for Palestinians, we don't have a choice, right? It's kind of like, it gets tiring, right? It's like kind of asking Palestinians, why are you so mad all the time? It's like, you know, like we can't just opt out of the fight at any given time. Like there's an affront on sort of our very existence all the time. And we're always hit with backlash, but like our allies who we build with can play a really integral role in helping sort of do what folks did for me when I faced that backlash, because that backlash was scary. It was scary, like I couldn't even go to the bathroom in my own restaurant because I couldn't cross the courtyard, because you had these protesters sort of being physically assaulting, the people in my space. So yeah, I think there are parts that like are slow shifts, and that's the testament to the work that your generation has done, Hatem, is like we weren't saying Zionism is racism, 10 years ago. Like there's a reason why that has become a more normalized term. There's a reason why now we can at least, protest the policies and the Israeli government without being called anti-Semitic. People are, people kind of know better. And I think I discovered that. Like I was like, oh, we've moved to a different space. Like people are not calling me anti-Semitic. Like people are not falling for these tropes in the same way that maybe they were more effective, 5-10 years ago. So I know that my work comes on the backs of, or, is a continuation of the work of generations before me who paved that path.
Yeah. Maybe you could give maybe advice to some of our up-and-coming Palestinians, Arabs, allies that are thinking about the food space, both as a political act, but also as an act of love for continuation of culture, tradition, some of the recipes from grandma that could be transformed in ways. And then maybe also you could think about what are your favorite things to make and why, as we get to the end part of our conversation.
Well, I think one of the byproducts of the work that I've done in this space is really getting to understand what food sovereignty means. Like that wasn't a concept to me until I sort of entered this space and engaged with people on the ground here doing work around food sovereignty, only to understand the parallels and the intersections with people on the ground working on food sovereignty issues in Palestine. And so that to me feels very profound. The fact that I'm on this continuum of work that if you think about it, like my family is from Gaza, right? And like some of the dishes that are indigenous to that area are no longer being cooked there, right? Like because of the fact that Israel controls all the waters, they control all the movement, it's an open air prison. So like fish, right? Or msakhan, which is, one of the national dishes of Palestine. Like the people from Gaza cannot make their msakhan with olive oil, which is the key component of msakhan. They're making it with like whatever, US or whatever the aid, the international aid organizations are, UNRWA, exactly, are giving them, which is like probably crappy, GMO canola oil. So they're not even getting the true potential of this dish as it was. So like my act of making this dish preserves that dish in its place of origin, it can no longer be made. There's something very powerful of carrying that and being able to keep these dishes alive, or sort of the sayadiyya that my grandma used to make, right? And the stories that I've heard, but like my family over there are no longer making that dish. So the preservation of our dishes is in and of itself a political act. Engaging other people who don't know about Palestinian dishes also is a political act, because it gets them to ask the story behind that. And unfortunately, or fortunately for us, because there is sort of a conversation to be had, is that a lot of times the story, that dish, involves a lot of stories about colonization and occupation and how we overcame it, right? And how as Arabs we adapted. And like there are lessons to be learned from all of these dishes. So I feel like those are things that I learned, sort of like food sovereignty is about being able to control our own means and our stories and our narratives and the way that we live off the land. And for Palestinians, food is connected to the land. We are a people who live off the land, and that is being taken away from us. So our fight for our food and the preservation for our food is connected to the fight for the land. Like those two things are integral. And I think for me, as somebody living in diaspora, that helps me understand the role that I have to play in supporting people on the ground, fighting to save their seeds, fighting to get those resources to their community, fighting to build these cooperative movements to like control their labor and their relationship to the land. So I think, you know, thinking about sort of how is my work connected to the work back in the homeland, because I'm very internationalist, but I'm also very, and I think this could speak to a lot of people in your class, is like, what's inspiring is doing work on the local level and seeing that change. That's what really attracted me to community organizing, because I really wanted to see the fruits of that transformation right in front of me. And you can do both. You can impact sort of on a level that's so much bigger than you. And then in terms of like my favorite foods, I mean, I think some of my favorite foods are like the staples, you know, like the sakhan obviously is something. I mean, we have Reem's, you know, our most popular item is called the Pali Cali, which is a fusion of Palestine and California. And it's our best seller, you know, and not without good reason. It's like, you know, slow braised Palestinian. We do a California flair on it. We throw some arugula up in there, but you know, like that's the other thing about Arab cooking. It's very versatile and it's not rigid the way people think. It's only the immigrants here that think it's rigid. But if you go back to the homeland, you know, our people are adapting to whatever comes their way, right?
People just don't realize that Palestine is one of the earliest places for actual agricultural development, domestication of animals. So whatever recipe you have, it has like been perfected over 8,000 to 10,000 years.
Exactly. And it's probably changed based on the land and all of these things. So like, that dish, maqlube, which, you know, obviously is a dish that actually connects all of us from the diaspora to folks living within 1948 to West Bank to Gaza. Like we all have sort of a version of it.
On which time
the fight over it. Yeah, exactly. The fight over which one. It's kind of like za'atar. Like everybody thinks their za'atar is the best, but you know, everybody's za'atar is good. Like we don't need to be competing over whose is the best. But and then obviously knafe is, you know, like a favorite pastime. It's something that reminds me of my grandfather in particular. He was a knafe master, and it's really sort of something, you know, if my grandmother sort of ruled the kitchen, my grandfather really sort of, knafe was his thing and his domain. And I love that. I love that there was like specialties that they had. So for those who are unfamiliar with knafe, it's like hot sweet cheese with shredded phyllo and butter and syrup, and it's just delicious. So we try to recreate those experiences at Reem's. It's like, even if you've never tried this thing before, we hope that it invites you to ask questions, but also to feel some sort of, I mean, I have Americans tell me this reminds me of my grandmother, even though it has nothing to do with their grandmother. So, and
I know you have a training program or like a class for, so talk about that and where the people can get involved if they want, you know, connect with you on that, because that's another way, unless you're not taking a new.
Well, you know, we're always like open, you know, I mean, so one of the things that we are exploring, COVID really sort of put the writing on the wall that we don't want to engage in the food industry. Like the food industry is highly inequitable. It hurts people, like everybody in the food system that is hurt are people of color, indigenous folks, Black folks. And we want to, if we are to change the industry, we need to also change the way we operate as a business. So we are exploring sort of a transition to worker ownership. And
we have experience in the Bay Area, you know, Cheese Board, Arizmendi.
Yeah, I was part of Arizmendi. Yes. Yeah, so I have some experience.
I remember when you were in Lakeshore. Yeah, so is it Lakeshore or the Emeryville one?
Emeryville. I was at Emeryville.
Because I used to go to I actually used to go to the Lakeshore one,
Yeah.
but every once in a while I did the one on Emeryville on San Pablo
Yeah.
Avenue.
Yeah. Yeah. And
It's
so
a
I'm
really
very
great
fun.
model.
It is. It is. And they're like, it's a harder model in this economy. And so what we really need to be doing is using this moment where people are questioning, especially people in the food world, how am I going to restart my business? Could we spread the gospel of sharing ownership and governance with our employees? I think what needs to happen, sort of how we talk about transformation of consciousness of like our customers, we also need to do that with workers. So we're building a pilot program. It's like an apprenticeship program called Samud, where, which in Arabic is steadfast resilience. It's a worker resilience program. And the idea is that, we need to be focusing on these mutual aid networks and like networks in which we have shared ownership to protect ourselves from the shocks of climate change, the shocks of the economy, of capitalism. How do we create these ecosystems that are fair and equitable? And in order to do that, there needs to be political education. Like, we need to work from the ground up with and there's no better place to do it than with workers in the food system who've been disproportionately impacted. So,
and then you could incorporate local farming, urban
exactly,
farms, and
all of the things. Yeah,
the
sort
things
of rebuilding the network. And so we're starting this pilot program. It won't be till early next year, but we're definitely sort of wanting to figure out a way to engage community in it. And if you want to be a part of Reem's and you want to be an owner, you have to go through this apprenticeship program.
Excellent.
In order to, so it's cool. It's like building our muscle for collective governance, but also unlearning and healing from the trauma that's, related to like racism and capitalism here in this country. Like, we have to unlearn some of those things because we bring those into the spaces and we replicate them, even if we're called a cooperative. If we haven't unlearned some of those things we've been taught, we're just going to replicate. So yeah, we're trying to do some things that are a little bit on the more revolutionary side. We'll see how they go, but we're in the meantime, we're struggling in this very, very challenging time here with COVID. Yeah, we've, shut Oakland down to the public. We will reopen it one time, but it's basically a mutual aid facility now. We're producing thousands of meals every week, and we're getting paid $10 a meal to support the community. So we're able to employ
the people that
our
are working,
documented workers, like workers who cannot receive unemployment, and so we've been able to keep our employees working through sort of that program. And we're still open in the Mission. So if you guys haven't visited us, it's shameless plug for the restaurant.
There's no shameless plug again. Instead of what you call ordering through the corporate one size fit all, that basically eating the wrapping of the food is much healthier than the food itself. Is definitely something to think about. So by all means, where is the address in the Mission, if you could give it to us?
We are on 25th and Mission Street, on the corner of Mission and 25th, right outside of the 24th Street bar.
So there's
the old Answer building.
Yeah, the Answer building. We had spent so many times, so many days organizing from way back.
What used to be Mission Pie, if anybody knew what that business was before. So
great. So
2901 Mission Street.
Make sure to go down to the 25th and Mission and try and both to support the local, but also to engage in some consciousness raising opportunity. Definitely there's a connection.
Talk to your people about where hummus comes from. Do not let them. It is an Arabic word for chickpea. Do not let anyone call hummus black bean hummus.
And I also encourage you to actually pick a recipe from Reem of how to make hummus. It's very easy. You don't need to go to Costco.
Inshallah, I have a cookbook coming out in the spring.
And
so
we look forward look forward to have it. Really, it was a pleasure to having you with us, Reem.
Thank you for having me.
Enriching conversation. We wish you all the best, and we'll continue to direct people. And definitely will come and visit, and look forward to continue to have your success as connected to the community, building community through food, and through resistance. Thank you.
Thank you.
مع السلامة.
مع السلامة.